The night it all tipped over, I stood on my sister's porch in Fort Worth, Texas, listening to Harold Burke curse into the dark. His voice carried over the irrigation canal like gravel dragged across sheet metal, and the stink of cheap whiskey followed it. He had spent years treating that strip of water like it was his private moat, stomping across our property with muddy boots, dragging hoses, and insisting that only he knew how to manage the flow. But that night, he slurred out the one word that tore through every ounce of patience my sister Rebecca had left. Whore. He said it once, then again, louder, so the wind carried it to every house on Oak Creek Lane. I froze in place, fists tightening around the railing. Rebecca stood beside me, her lips pressed thin, tears gathering, but not falling. She had endured years of his trespassing, his late-night shouting, the way he sometimes left empties of Bud Light on her porch like trophies of his harassment. But she had never endured that word. And in that moment, neighbor revenge stopped being an idea whispered after too many sleepless nights. It became a mission. I am her younger brother, Daniel Hayes, 35, a contractor with calloused hands and a short fuse when it comes to family. I moved back from Austin after my divorce, figuring Rebecca could use the company. She never asked for help, but I knew she needed it. Living alone with a drunk neighbor leaning against her fence every weekend was no life. At first, I tried to be the reasonable one. I told her we could call the irrigation district, that we could report trespassing, maybe install a higher fence. She always said the same thing. He is old. He will fade out sooner than later. Just let him be. But when Harold let that word fly, when his laughter rattled across the neighborhood like a shotgun blast, I stopped thinking about patience. I started thinking about paperwork. That may sound strange. Most people expect revenge to involve fists, or at least a shouting match at the property line. But I had learned something in the years running my contracting business. In America, nothing destroys a man faster than stacked paper, citations, complaints, insurance claims, federal codes. Paper can drain a man dry before he knows he is drowning. And Harold, he was ripe for drowning. The morning after the insult, Rebecca sat at the kitchen table with her coffee cold and untouched. I laid out my plan on the counter between us, using receipts and old tax forms as scratch paper. First, the irrigation canal. It was a community-maintained structure, not his private ditch. He had rerouted flow illegally for years. Second, his property insurance. Harold's fence leaned across county easements. His sheds had been wired with his drunken hand, and no permits. Third, his taxes. Rebecca's friend at the diner whispered that Harold had been renting part of his garage to some drifter without declaring a dime. Each point was a lever, and I intended to pull them all. Rebecca looked at me, her eyes swollen but determined. Daniel, I do not want him dead. I just want him to stop. I nodded. Then we will bury him under everything he never thought could touch him. That was the beginning. I started with the water. Texas law is cruel and clear about shared irrigation. No one owns it, and tampering is theft. I called the Tarrant County Water Authority, filed a formal complaint, and attached photographs of Harold's little dams. Within a week, men in hard hats were digging up his pipes. Harold stumbled out to scream, waving a lawn chair like a weapon, but the workers ignored him. They carried a county order. He could not fight it. That night, I watched him stare at the dry canal from his porch, rocking in his chair with a bottle that looked like gasoline in the moonlight. But I did not stop there. I filed another report with code enforcement about his sheds. I had photographs of crooked extension cords and overloaded power strips. Within 2 weeks, an inspector left a bright orange sticker on his front door. Rebecca and I heard him cursing at the inspector from inside, his voice cracking with desperation. By the 3rd month, I dug deeper. I spent evenings in the county clerk's office, digging through public records. Sure enough, Harold had failed to list that rented garage on his taxes. I turned the documents over to the IRS fraud hotline. Call me petty, call me cold, but I watched my sister sleep for the first time in years without waking at 2 a.m. to screams, and I knew it was worth every minute. Yet, as much as I enjoyed dismantling Harold's kingdom one form at a time, the strangest thing happened. He started fighting back with conspiracy. He stopped yelling at Rebecca and instead muttered to passing neighbors about how we were government plants. And he said FEMA had hired us to sabotage his property before they turned the block into a flood zone. He mailed letters to the HOA warning that Rebecca and I were operatives. Most laughed it off, but a few nervous neighbors actually asked me if it was true. I shook my head, but inside I smiled. His paranoia was eating him alive. That to me was sweeter than any shouted argument across the fence. The climax came one afternoon when Harold slipped on his own broken porch step. His insurance adjuster came out, saw the condemned sheds, the dry canal, the citations, and wrote him a notice. Coverage denied due to code violations. His face crumpled like wet paper when he opened the letter on his porch. I watched from Rebecca's window. He crumpled it, threw it, then sat down and sobbed like a man who had lost a war he never understood. Rebecca asked me later that night, "Do you feel better now?" I stared at the stack of copies I kept, citations, reports, tax filings. My trophies. Better? No, I said, but he will never call you that word again. She nodded, her face calm for the first time in years. And yet, the strangest thing is that I did not stop. Once you taste neighbor revenge like that, you see the world differently. Harold was not just a drunk old man anymore. He was a symbol of how arrogance collapses when pressed by the very system he thought he was above. He still rocked in his chair every night, staring across at us, but he did not speak, not a single word. I will admit, sometimes I imagine him surrounded by files, papers fluttering like birds, drowning not in whiskey, but in bureaucracy. That is the true American ending. Not a fight, not blood on the porch, but a man suffocated by the rules he thought he could ignore. And that is how I, Daniel Hayes, brother of Rebecca, learned that revenge does not always come with fists or fire. Sometimes it comes in envelopes stamped with federal seals, delivered by a tired postal worker who has no idea he is carrying justice across Oak Creek Lane. It is funny how fast people forget the way things were. Before Harold's collapse, Oak Creek Lane was a place where folks waved from porches, kids sold lemonade in the summer, and neighbors talked about football over picket fences. After Harold's collapse, it turned into something else. You could feel it in the air, like everyone was waiting for the next citation, the next envelope, the next hammer of bureaucracy to fall. I never thought of myself as a man who enjoyed paperwork, but every morning when the mail truck rattled down the street, I stood by the window like a kid at Christmas, because I knew that somewhere inside that stack of envelopes, Harold's world was shrinking another inch. That was my neighbor revenge, plain and pure. The insult had been weeks ago, but the echo of that word still rang inside Rebecca's chest. She told me she could not hear Harold's name without tasting bile. Yet, she was calmer now. She sat on her porch with her sweet tea, sunglasses hiding her eyes, watching as Harold limped across his yard, muttering to himself. She whispered to me once, "It feels like he has aged 10 years in 10 weeks." And she was right. His posture sagged. His yard was overgrown. His Bud Light cans stacked up faster than the trash man picked them up. He was rotting in place. But here is where the story twisted. Harold stopped being just one drunk old neighbor. He started spinning into myth. He told anyone who would listen that Rebecca and I were agents of a federal water conspiracy. At first, the neighbors chuckled. But then Harold started leaving pamphlets in their mailboxes, pages photocopied crooked, filled with diagrams of canals, FEMA flood maps, and rants about hydrological warfare. He scribbled our names into his theories, warning that we were planted to soften Oak Creek for takeover. I swear to God, Mrs. Jameson from across the street pulled me aside one Sunday and asked, dead serious, if we worked for the Bureau of Reclamation. I laughed, but her face was stone. That was when I realized Harold's madness was contagious. The man was infecting the neighborhood with paranoia, so I leaned into it. If Harold wanted a conspiracy, I would feed him one. I called a buddy who worked at the county survey office. For a few beers, he slipped me old blueprints of the irrigation system, massive, unreadable maps stamped with federal logos. I taped one of them to our garage wall, visible from Harold's porch. Then I started carrying folders outside, stuffed with blank paper but labeled Water Division, Classified. I made sure Harold saw. His eyes bulged like a frog's. He started writing letters at all hours, his typewriter clacking until dawn. One night, I caught him crouched by the canal, scribbling in a notebook while pointing a flashlight at the water like he was hunting submarines. His silhouette looked like a ghost commander lost in his last war. And Rebecca, sitting beside me in the kitchen, whispered, "Do you ever feel sorry for him?" I answered without thinking. No, not for him, but for whoever has to read his letters, maybe. The beauty of American revenge is that it never ends with one agency. Once the machine starts, it multiplies. By month 4, Harold was juggling code enforcement citations, IRS inquiries, water authority fines, and insurance denials. But then the banks got involved. I had reported the shed rental, and when the IRS froze part of his account, the local credit union followed with a suspicious activity review. Imagine it, a man who used to strut drunk down the block, now standing in line at the bank, begging a 20-year-old teller to release his funds. I heard about it from Mrs. Jameson, who swore he cried right there at the counter. Rebecca told me one night, "Daniel, this is starting to feel like overkill." But then she remembered that night on the porch, that word hanging in the air like poison, and she stayed quiet. She knew as well as I did. This was not over until Harold knew he was beaten, not by fists, not by shouts, but by the very system he thought he was too clever to obey. Still, part of me wondered if I was becoming the villain. I had dreams where Harold stood in a courtroom, wild-eyed, waving his pamphlets while a judge glared down at me. In those dreams, the judge always said the same thing. "Mr. Hayes, is this about law or is it about pride?" I never answered because the truth scared me. The next twist came with his insurance. After his claim denial, Harold thought he could sue. He sent Rebecca a handwritten notice, 3 pages of crooked lines and whiskey stains, claiming she had sabotaged his property value. He threatened to drag her to court. Rebecca cried that night, clutching the paper like a summons to hell. But I knew better. I called my cousin in Dallas, a paralegal, who laughed so hard he nearly choked. "He cannot even spell tort," he said. "Do not worry." Still, I filed the letter with the county anyway. Another record, another nail. By summer, Harold had lost more than money. He lost his grip on time. He shouted at passing cars, swearing the license plates were encoded messages. He left notes taped to our mailbox, warning of flood-level psyops. And then one morning, Rebecca found him standing in our yard, clutching a garden gnome like it was a grenade. His eyes were glassy, his words a slurry of accusations about federal gnome surveillance. She screamed, and I ran out with my phone, snapping photos as he staggered back across the canal. That photo became Exhibit A in my trespassing complaint. It was no longer about peace. It was about building a fortress of paper so thick he could never breach it again. Every complaint, every letter, every photo, I stacked them in a fireproof box under my bed. My trophies, my arsenal. I imagined a future where Harold's name was blacklisted in every federal database, flagged as a nuisance until the day he died. That was my justice. But revenge has a way of circling back. One night, Rebecca woke me at 2 a.m, shaking my shoulder. "Daniel," she whispered, "the canal is running again." I stumbled outside and sure enough, water gushed through, glistening under the streetlights. But the irrigation district had shut it down months ago. Where was it coming from? Then I saw the hoses. Harold had rigged a pump from his well, funneling water back into the canal. He was trying to prove his kingdom still lived. I laughed so hard I nearly collapsed. Rebecca stared at me, horrified. "He is losing his mind, and you are laughing?" I nodded, wiping my eyes. "Because this is the end game. He is fighting the entire system with a garden pump." I filed another complaint the next morning, attaching photos of the hoses, the pump, the glittering stream he thought was salvation. The water authority's letter arrived within a week. Unauthorized pumping, federal violation, fines exceeding $5,000. Harold ripped the letter up on his porch, but the fines did not vanish. Nothing vanishes when the machine is grinding. And as I sat beside Rebecca that night, listening to the faint hum of Harold's dying pump, I realized the revenge had transformed. It was no longer about one insult. It was about watching a man fight shadows until the shadows swallowed him whole. And in America, there is no shadow darker than a ledger filled with debt, fines, and unanswered letters stamped "Final Notice." By the time September rolled around, Oak Creek Lane looked less like a quiet Texas neighborhood and more like a crime scene draped in paperwork. Mailboxes bulged with letters, not love letters or catalogs, but thick envelopes stamped with government seals. Harold had become the star of his own bureaucratic tragedy, and my sister Rebecca and I were the unwilling audience. Every day I added another document to the fireproof box under my bed. Code violation notices, property tax discrepancies, insurance denials, federal fines. It was not a scrapbook. It was a coffin, and Harold was lying inside it without realizing the lid was closing. Rebecca kept asking me, "Daniel, how far are you going to take this?" And I would answer with the truth, "As far as the law lets me." because this was not about fists or shouting. This was neighbor revenge in its most American form: law, finance, insurance, and the slow chokehold of bureaucracy. Harold's descent into madness had become something of a sideshow. He was no longer just the drunk old man at the end of the block. He was a prophet of nonsense. He stood on his porch with a bullhorn one Saturday, shouting about how the Department of Homeland Security was trying to weaponize water tables and that Rebecca was a FEMA siren sent to seduce him into silence. He slurred through his rants, veins bulging in his forehead, his shirt stained with Bud Light. Some neighbors filmed him for Facebook, their laughter echoing across the street, while others started avoiding the block altogether. But the one thing that mattered most: he never called my sister that word again, and still he would not stop. That was when I decided to escalate. I had already crippled him with local code enforcement, the Water Authority, and the IRS. But Harold's arrogance gave me a new angle. He still had his pickup, an ancient Ford with expired registration and a cracked windshield. I snapped photos and reported him to the DMV. Within a month, he was slapped with another fine. Then I noticed his porch railings, rotting wood, nails sticking out like teeth, unsafe structure violation. Another complaint filed, another citation delivered. The beauty of American systems is that once you prime them, they keep going on their own. The insurance companies talk to the banks talk to the county, and the county talks to the IRS. It is like setting dominoes, and Harold was the fool who built his house right in the middle of the chain. One evening I sat at the diner, scribbling notes on a napkin, while Rebecca sipped her coffee. I was drafting my next move, and it was ambitious. Harold had been bragging for years about his veterans discount, even though no one had ever seen a service record. If he lied about that, the Department of Veterans Affairs would not take it lightly. I filed a tip. I did not know if he was bluffing or not, but when the investigators came knocking, the look on Harold's face told me everything. Rebecca stared at me that night. "Daniel, this is turning into something else. He is broken. Can you not see it?" But I did see it, and I could not look away. Harold's paranoia reached new heights. He started building barricades in his yard out of trash cans and plywood, spray painting them with words like water rights and no federal trespass. He nailed an old stop sign to his gate like a badge of sovereignty. He mailed letters to Congress, to the president, even to NASA. He told the mailman that satellites were tracking him because of the Hayes siblings. The satire of it all was almost too perfect. Here was a man who once ruled our little canal like a king, reduced to fighting satellites with spray paint and plywood. Neighbors whispered that Harold had gone completely insane, but I knew better. He had not gone insane. He had been forced to live inside the very system he mocked, and it was squeezing him dry. The real climax came when the IRS froze his accounts completely. I watched from my truck as a tow company hooked his Ford and hauled it down the street. He stood in the yard, waving his arms, screaming that it was all part of a financial coup. When the truck disappeared, Harold collapsed in the dirt, sobbing into his hands. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. But then I remembered Rebecca crying at our kitchen table, her hands shaking around a cold cup of coffee after he called her that word. No, pity had no place here. It was not enough to bury Harold in fines. I wanted him documented forever. I filed public records requests, making sure every citation, every complaint, every denied claim had a permanent digital footprint. If Harold ever tried to sell his property, any buyer would see the mountain of violations attached. If he tried to apply for insurance again, the denial history would follow him. In America, reputation is not just gossip, it is paperwork. And I made sure Harold's paperwork was poison. Rebecca began to notice the shift in me. She said I smiled more when the mail truck came than when I talked to her. She asked if revenge was all I thought about anymore. And maybe she was right. I caught myself dreaming of envelopes, dreaming of fines stamped final notice. I imagined Harold's obituary someday, not a story of a man, but a list of unpaid debts and unresolved complaints. But the strangest twist came from Harold himself. Instead of fighting, he leaned deeper into his conspiracies. He claimed he was not losing. He was resisting the deep state. He told anyone who would listen that he was under attack by hydrological operatives. Some local college kid even interviewed him for a podcast, laughing at him behind the mic. Harold did not notice. He spoke like a general in exile, convinced he was leading a rebellion no one else could see. The irony was perfect. My neighbor revenge had turned into Harold's delusion. I had buried him with paperwork, but in his mind, he had been elevated into legend, a man so important the government conspired to crush him. And honestly, that was the most American irony of all. In this country, even a drunk old neighbor could cast himself as the hero of his own conspiracy, while the rest of us filed complaints and watched him sink. One night, I found him in the canal again, this time digging at the dirt with a shovel, muttering about new water lines. Rebecca asked me if we should call someone, maybe get him help. I shook my head. This is his help. He is too busy fighting phantoms to fight you anymore. And I was right. Harold never called her that word again. He barely looked at us. His war was no longer with us, but with the system itself. And the system does not lose. That was the beauty of it, the poetry hidden in the piles of envelopes and notices. We had not beaten Harold with fists or shouting matches. We had beaten him with the thing most Americans fear more than anything, the slow, relentless crush of bureaucracy. Neighbor revenge had not just silenced him, it had transformed him into a parody of himself, a relic babbling to the stars while his world collapsed around him. And as I lay in bed that night, Rebecca asleep down the hall, I knew this was not the end. Because the machine never stops once it starts. Harold's story was still unfolding, one envelope at a time, and I intended to watch every chapter until the very last page. By the time winter crept across Oak Creek Lane, the neighborhood had stopped pretending Harold was just a drunk old man. He had become a landmark, a cautionary tale, the kind of story whispered over bar stools and gas station counters. People slowed their cars to look at his barricaded yard, where spray-painted plywood and broken lawn furniture leaned together like the remnants of a failed revolution. He had not cut his grass in months. He let his mailbox overflow until envelopes spilled like snowdrifts across his porch. But he still sat there every night in his rocking chair, wrapped in a tattered jacket, staring at Rebecca's house like he was watching an enemy outpost. The machine had done its work. The county had placed liens on his property for unpaid fines. His Ford was long gone. The bank had frozen his accounts. Insurance companies would not touch him. Even his Bud Light deliveries had stopped after he bounced too many checks at the liquor store. He was a king without a throne, a general without an army. And yet, he still muttered about conspiracies, still waved his fists at satellites, still scribbled letters to Congress that would never be read. Rebecca asked me one night, her voice soft, "Daniel, is this enough?" She stood by the kitchen window, watching Harold struggle to drag a broken garden hose across his dead lawn. "You wanted him buried in paperwork. He is buried. He has nothing left. Can we stop now?" But that was the question that haunted me. Could I stop? The fireproof box under my bed was overflowing. I had documents stamped with county seals, state seals, federal seals. I had built a paper monument taller than any fence Harold had ever climbed. And I kept asking myself whether I was still doing this for Rebecca or for me. The truth came to me the night Harold collapsed. It was early January, the air sharp enough to cut your lungs. Rebecca and I were drinking coffee in the kitchen when we heard the crash. I rushed to the window and saw Harold lying in his yard, tangled in the plywood barricade he had built. His shovel was still clutched in one hand, as if he had been trying to dig another trench against the imaginary invasion. For a moment, I thought it was the end. I thought the man had finally keeled over, swallowed by his own madness. Rebecca wanted to call 911. I hesitated. My first thought was not about saving him. It was about the stack of unpaid bills in his mailbox, the liens, the fines, the frozen accounts. I imagined the paramedics arriving, shaking their heads, calling the county, and the machine chewing him up one last time. But then I saw Rebecca's face. She was crying, whispering, "No one deserves to die like this." So I called. The ambulance came, lights flashing, neighbors peeking from behind curtains. They hauled Harold away, still breathing, still muttering about FEMA. And for the first time in years, his porch was empty. That night, Rebecca said something I will never forget. "Daniel, revenge cannot be the only thing we live for. Look at him. He is already gone." Her words hit me harder than any of Harold's insults ever had. Because she was right. Harold was not my enemy anymore. He was a ruin. And ruins do not need enemies. They need time to crumble. Weeks passed. Harold did not come back. Rumors spread that he had been placed in a county facility, too unstable to live alone. His house sat vacant, the barricades collapsing in the wind, the canal flowing quietly without his interference. Oak Creek Lane breathed again. Kids played outside. Neighbors waved at Rebecca. The air felt lighter. One Saturday, Rebecca and I walked past Harold's place. The plywood was gone, hauled away by the city. The grass was matted and dead. His porch chair sat empty, rocking slowly in the breeze. Rebecca stopped, staring at the house, then turned to me. "Do you feel it?" she asked. "Peace." I nodded. But inside I felt something else, an emptiness where my mission had been. For months I had lived on revenge, feeding it with paperwork, stoking it with complaints. Now, with Harold gone, I felt like a soldier after the war, staring at a battlefield with no enemies left. And that is when I realized the truth. Revenge had given me purpose, but peace was what my sister needed. The whole time she had endured the harassment, the insults, the trespassing. She had borne the weight. My revenge had been loud and cruel and thorough, but her peace was quiet. She did not want Harold destroyed. She wanted him irrelevant. And now he was. So, I let it go. I packed up the fireproof box, every citation, every notice, every scrap of paper, and I carried it to the backyard. Rebecca watched as I poured lighter fluid over the stack and lit a match. The flames roared, papers curling, seals dissolving, ink vanishing into smoke. For a moment, I thought about the hours I had spent gathering those documents, the pride I had taken in each envelope. But as the smoke rose into the Texas sky, I felt lighter. I felt free. Rebecca slipped her arm around me. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not for the revenge, for standing by me." That night, for the first time in years, we slept without listening for Harold's voice, without watching the canal for movement, without waiting for the next insult. Oak Creek Lane was quiet. I still think about Harold sometimes. Maybe he is still muttering in some county hospital, warning nurses about hydrological warfare and FEMA satellites. Maybe he believes he won, that he resisted until the end. Let him believe it. Because the truth is simple. He lost the moment he called my sister that word. He wrote his own ending, and the machine simply carried it out. Neighbor revenge is not always about fists or fire. Sometimes it is about patience, paperwork, and letting the weight of the system crush arrogance into dust. But in the end, it is not about victory. It is about peace. My sister finally has hers, and I, her brother Daniel Hayes, learned that the sweetest revenge is not seeing your enemy destroyed. It is watching your sister live free of him, smiling on her porch, the past drifting away like ashes in the wind.